Hello, this is Adem Carroll from Burma Task Force, a program of justice for all, working on behalf of human rights in Burma, especially with a focus on the Rohingya. In today's conversation, we'll be speaking with experts on Rohingya education, denial, and crisis. Rohingya have been denied access to education, and we have heard from Rohingya in the communities, in the diaspora, in the camps, that this is a huge issue that needs much more attention. We have written a study based on other studies. I have to say that as I researched this, a lot of the work is a bit like PR, just very basic studies of expenses and expenditures in the field. But then you do find academic studies, research that give a lot more attention to the human rights, the right to education, the right to partner with the Rohingya in order to create an educational system. And so we'll be speaking a bit about this report first, and then go to our guests, who I'm very, very pleased to have with us. Bill van Esveld is with Human Rights Watch, working on children's rights for many years. Jessica Olney is visiting researcher, focusing on refugees, statelessness, migration, peace building, human rights, and protection in fragile contexts, especially Myanmar or Burma. And she has served as Bangladesh country director for an organization focused on Rohingya issues. We have Burma Task Force Program Associate Imran Hoque, a Rohingya refugee, who is now finishing his second year of college in the United States at Truman University. And he is very, very passionate on the need for education. And also we have Brother Abdullah Habib, who is a videographer and who is actually joining us from the camps right now and has created a video for us, allowing the voices of Rohingya to be heard. And again, voices expressing the wish for education, for a future. Special thanks to Anika Rahman, because she helped us with interviews with NGOs, including Help Cox's Bazaar and Bangladesh Foundation. Also Imam Malik, who may be joining us a little later for his research on madrasas as a grassroots community alternative. Also, of course, again, to Brother Abdullah for some of his photos, which are in the report, which can be found on our website, Burma Task Force. I wanted to just basically say the report has a main focus on Bangladesh. However, we have to admit that this problem of lack of access to education starts decades ago, really 2 generations ago, but it starts in Burma. The systematic restriction of rights, the right of movement, free movement in Rakhine State, especially after 2012, the lockdown, the denial of classes in university. All of this means that in a state, Rakhine State, which has 84.7% literacy, according to the government there, you have a very, very low literacy rate among Rohingya who have been denied access to the schools. On page 22 of our report, we mentioned a health and human rights study that found that 76% of Rohingya arriving in the camps reported having no education. Madrasas even went underground. Certification ended. There was no pathway to higher education. Very few Rohingya were able to get around that terrible kind of open air prison. Of course, in 2017, with the mass atrocities, the military clearance operation, and 750,000 Rohingya fled their burning villages into Bangladesh. We focus a lot on the conditions in Bangladesh camps. Those conditions also, again, insufficient services, as you'll hear in the film that we'll be showing in just a minute. The report also talks about the access that Rohingya refugees have to education, the lack of access in India and in Malaysia, in Saudi Arabia. Many of the same problems are repeated there. And whether or not a particular country has signed on to the rights of the child or other treaties, we see that again and again, Rohingya are left outside the door. And so we have a very detailed study, and we hope that this will help push the global conversation towards restoring education, restoring a future to the Rohingya people, and giving hope to the children who are crying out for this. So much more could be said, but I'm going to now ask our tech producer to put up the short video that Brother Abdullah has put together. This is an excerpt of 5.5 minutes.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullah. Ana Muhammad Saad. Ailam de Rohingya community udo tuniyot. To ara Rohingya community 2017 mode din Burmatun genocide আর মেসিকিয়ার সার্ভাইভ করি ওরে বাংলাদেশের রিফিউজি ক্যাম্প মধ্যে আইরে জীবন হারায় তো রে আর ইউথ কল যারা আছে আব্দুল্লাহ হাজার ইউথ ক্যাম্প মধ্যে আছে তো আরা এখন সময় আছে আর ইম্পর্টেন্ট টাইম আমার লাইফর আর এডুকেশন হতে জিনিস না পার আর এখন আমি কলম শিখি না পারিস এডুকেশনের অ্যাক্সেস হদিন একদম নাই আর তোর কেমন মধ্যে তো আর সময় আন্দাজে বেকার হনো হাজত নগলাইরে আর সময় ফুরে আর কই আর আরা ইয়ার আগে বর্মার তাকিতেও বছরে আগইতে মানে 20 বছর আগইতে আর বর্মার তাকিতেও এডুকেশন হতে জিনিস না পাই এডুকেশনের অ্যাক্সেস না হয় পুরোপুরিভাবে আর রাইটারও রেস্ট্রিক্ট করে আসছিল আর ডিসক্রিমিনেট করছে আর স্কুলত কলেজের মধ্যে রোহিঙ্গা পয়েন্টে যে দূর রাইট ফাইবার আসছিল দূর এডুকেশন লেভেল হাসিল করে আসছিল গড়ি না পারে তো ইয়ার পরে কেমন মধ্যে আইরি আরও আছে দিন আর সিচুয়েশন খারাপ হয়ে গিয়ে
আর সমাজের মধ্যে 90% মায়া হয় বেলমদার কিন্তু আতুকান ড্রিম আছে যে সমাজের ফুটুক মায়া হয় না এলমদার বানাবাল্লা কোরিয়া বানাবাল্লা আর মায়া হয় নে ফান্না নফরনের জড়িয়া ইতার একটু পরবর্তী জাহেরি ডোমেস্টিক ভায়োলেন্স জেন্ডার বেসড ভায়োলেন্স চাইল্ড ম্যারেজের শিকার হওয়া মায়া ফোনের বাম্মারে এওয়ার করিছে ইতার জাফাইনারে ফান্না করাই বললাই সরে বিয়া নদীবর লাবলি তো আই জানি দে ইয়ান হালিগা আনলা গলে আসান নগো আয়ান জানি কিন্তু তারপরেও আই নিজাম মারি তাকি না পারি দে যদি আই নিজাম মারি তাকি আর পুরা সমাজের মায়া হয় বেলন্দার মরে যাব আর পুরা সমাজের তো এলমদার ইন্দিলা কান নামাকান যাইবে
আসসালামু আলাইকুম রহমতুল্লাহ বরকাতুহু আন্নাম হুজ্জাতুল্লাহ তাই আই গো কমিউনিটি টিচার আর হিউম্যানিটেরিয়ান ওয়ার্কার তো কিন্তু খত হলে আই যেন এক্সপিরিয়েন্স করছি খাস করিওরে আর এনভায়রনমেন্টরে অ্যানালাইজ করিওরে সাই দেহেড়ে উতরে এটা কিছু আরা সার্ভিস পাই দেহেড়ে ওভারঅল সার্ভিস দাসে পয়লা শুরুতে হইতো চাইলে ইনসাফিসিয়েন্ট অধ্যয়ন আছে পয়লা শুরুতে এখনের টাইম মাঝে কি চলে হইলে মনসুন টাইম আছে বারিশার টাইম ইবাম মাঝে হাঁসগুড়ি ক্যাম এরিয়া হদ্দিহিন্দ আছে বেহিসা মুরা হাইন্দা হাইন্দা ভাঙিজার গিয়ে ল্যান্ডস্লাইড অকল আছে তো ইনরে পয়লা শুরুতে গিয়ে হাঁসগুজিল ডিআরসি আছে বা কারিটাস আছে হিনে ডাইরেক্টলি সার্ভিস দিত এখন ব্রাক আয়রে আছে ইন্টারভেনশন করানোর জরিয়া ইতারা সার্ভিসরে ফ্রিলি দিনে হয় ইনাফ সার্ভিস দিনে হয় আর কমপ্লিটলি ডিলে সার্ভিস দের হেলথর গান বেশি ইমার্জেন্সি সার্ভিস পয়লা শুরুতে মানুষের তো এরে আবহাওয়া বেশি বালানো বিভিন্ন ধরনের বিয়ার আমকল মানুষ তো প্রতি বিয়ার আমার আসলে এটা ট্রিটমেন্ট নাই এফোর্ডেবল ন এটা আছে বিশাল লেবর হাসকল নাই অনেকক্ষণ টেস্ট ফেসিলিটি বেশি রুয়ে মানে খুব কম বিয়ার আমকলর ট্রিটমেন্ট দিয়া যাতে আছে তো জিন দের হিনো ইনাফ ন রিসেন্টলি করোনা ভাইরাস গুয়াইরে আর ডাইরেক্ট আর হালত বেশি দূরে নিজার গুদে আছে আর রিপাট্রিয়েশন বন্ধ হয়ে গিয়ে আদাসে করোনার জরিয়া এরে মানুষের লড়াচড়া জিন্দগি কমপ্লিটলি টাফ হয়ে গিয়ে তো আই আরো রিকোয়েস্ট করতে সাইডে ফাইলি যেদুন মানুষ আছে ক্যাম্পর মাঝে ইনল্লা বলি ওরে করোনা ভাইরাসল্লা যেদুন ভ্যাকসিন অকল বিভিন্ন দুনিয়াতো বানাতে আছে আর ওরে রাহাম করি ওরে আর কি গরম চা প্রটেক্ট করি পাল্লা বলি ওরে বেশি মোস্ট গ্যাদারিং করি তাকে দেখা লাই জায়গার মাঝে ভ্যাকসিন দন বেশি জরুরি তো এই হিসাবে আর ভ্যাকসিন দিব লাই দরখাস্ত করি প্রত্যেক জন অন বিহাফ অফ এভরি রোহিঙ্গা পিপল তো এই কি চাইল্ড লেবারিং জিনর এটা আছে বেশি চাইল্ড লেবারিং মানে কি ফগর হনা হতে না বাম্মা তো আর কম তো এ নিয়ে এলো আমার আহমিয়ত কম তো এখন আছে এরে ওয়াজাই ভাই তো এই সবে চাইল্ড লেবারিং খুব বেশি অধ্যে আছে তো ইনরে বাঁচি বললা বলি ওরা আর তো এডুকেশনাল ফ্যাসিলিটিরে মোটিভেট করা ফুরিব মারা ফুরিব তো আরো বহুত কিছু আছে হয়তো আজ যদু জানি দূর আই হইলাম আর হতে দূর মেসেজ করি আর তখন কান বলিলে মাফসাইর আসসালামু আলাইকুম ওয়া রাহমাতুল্লাহি ওয়া বারাকাতুহু
Okay, so we should come back. That was a short film by Abdullah Habib, who is with us now. I'm going to ask you to say a few words, both about the film and about yourself. Maybe we can get you to full screen. And Brother Abdullah, so tell us, how did you come to the camp? There you are. Nice to see your face. So yes, brother, how did you come? How did you come to the camps? What brought you here?
Yeah, thank you so much, Adem, for having me here and giving me chance to talk in this conversation. Firstly, yeah, I would like to share my story from Myanmar to Bangladesh. It is very well known. Everyone knows about it. How we fled to Bangladesh from Myanmar. In 2017, yes, I was teaching in a school as a volunteer teacher. After completing my matriculation, because I could not make way to university because we were not allowed to go university after 2012. Especially we Rohingya, a student, were not allowed to university. So I stopped studying and continues teaching to my community student as a volunteer teacher. So in 2017, when the violence was took place in our city, our town, mostly it was happened in Butidong, Ratidong, and Moundo Township in Triton. So, and in 25 August when we were sleeping at night. There was we heard a lot of uh, gun voice shooting everywhere, and people were shooting. And then next morning, and we see people leaving their home, leaving their village. And after we leave in our village and houses, and we saw our villages suddenly burning, um, because there was no people inside the villages, inside the houses. And after completely people leave the village, and the military have set the fire in our houses, and we were seeing our villages are burning. So, and also people were killing everywhere. So everyone have no option to stay there anymore. So people find out a way to Bangladesh. Finally, I also decided to flee. And on 2017 September, uh, maybe 5 or 6 September, I and my family fled to Bangladesh, and and we did not have any way to go somewhere else, because at that time the situation was very serious for us, for the whole entire community. And we arrived in Bangladesh, and the Bangladesh government, the military, army and polices brought us here in the camp. When we were coming here, the place where we staying now, we are hilly place. We didn't see any houses, any shelters. Finally, after arriving here, people started to build tarpaulin shelters and try to make shelter by themselves. And yeah, after 2 or 3 months, we saw we were seeing nearly 7 to 800,000 people already arrived in Bangladesh, become refugee, and took the shelter. So firstly, we thought that we would have everything in the camp, as uh, international community started focusing on our crisis. Finally, they listen our voices, our everything that we face in the country. And yeah, we are receiving foods, receiving shelters, receiving medicine, receiving healthcare. But we also uh, uh, thought that we would also have a school or education facilities, like we are getting other facilities. But it's been 4 years we didn't get these facilities in the camp. Our Rohingya youth have been trying to advocate on this matter with international community, uh, uh, agency, NGOs, also even with Bangladesh government, to have this education facility, especially formal education. But we didn't get this facility yet. But our Rohingya youth do not stop trying. How they are still finding way how to provide education to their own children. So mostly we found a way to educate our children. And our Rohingya youth started home-based education system in maybe 2018. but we face lots of challenges to carry out this education system because we do not have any support, any kind of support to move forward. And now even from 2020, our Rohingya youth started to open a learning center, community-based learning center with Burmese curriculum. So we have more than 10 learning center in the camp now that created, organized by our Rohingya youth with their own initiative, self-initiative. So also to run this learning center, we have to face lots of challenges because even in the camp, parents cannot support their children to have education in buying books or buying a stationery like this. So sometimes the teacher who are running this center, they contribute to buy books or stationery from their pocket money, but it also do not exist longer because we do not have any income source in the camp to earn money or livelihood program. So also we have to stop on half of the way uh, like this. So completely, we can say completely that we don't have any education access that we can, our children can learn, can get a formal education. So on behalf of our community, I would like to request a international community who, especially who work for the education, for the refugee education, to create an education system for our Rohingya children in the camp. So I hope we can find any possible solution for a community student with their teacher and children through this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brother Abdullah. That was perfect, and a reminder that if we want to know about the situation of Rohingya education, we should just ask the Rohingya, you who live there. Just reading a comment in the chat we get from Ashma Musa. She writes, I will never forget these sights. My husband and I went to serve the resilient people of Rohingya refugees, the most broken people on earth emotionally, mentally, and physically. The children's faces will never be forgotten. We hope to go back with Imana to serve them again. Whatever we can do is not enough to make them rise again. Each story was devastating, far from what you can imagine. Thank you for this awareness. Yeah, I mean, resilience. And again, the report found that Rohingya are really active in helping themselves, but there is a disconnect with the international helping community, with the humanitarian agencies, and with funding. And for example, lacking of certification, you can do education in learning centers, but it won't lead to higher education. So there's many systemic problems now with the situation. So I'm going to ask Jessica Olney to speak. And Jessica, you've worked with many research projects, and there are many like the Norwegian Peace Research Institute. We quote you in our report on, for example, on page 27, we quote you as saying about the Rohingya volunteer teachers, this cadre of community educators represents a wellspring of potential support to help humanitarian agencies engage more children in educational activities, promote girls' education, advise the development of new curriculum, advise on general education planning, and help prevent a lost generation overall. The apparent lack of consultation and engagement with these networks thus far indicates that their potential contributions to formal education programming are being overlooked. this has fueled negative views amongst these networks towards camp education agencies. So welcome, Jessica.
Thank you, Adam. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could speak to some of your research and especially, any conclusions that you may have come to.
Sure. Well, I think first of all, of course, every community and every family wants education for their children, and I think there's nothing unreasonable about the demands of camp residents to have greater education access. This would be the same in any community. And as Abdullah mentioned, the fears of a lost generation are real. I mean, it has been 4 years that children have been out of school. It's half of a primary education. And of course, COVID has only exacerbated that crisis. A lot of my research on education really just tries to sort of document the themes that Abdullah and the speakers in the video raised. I think I even saw a couple of them in the participant list, so just want to greet them and thank them for raising their voice with Abdullah's support. As Abdullah mentions, and my research attempts to document, the community is doing what they can with very, very limited resources. They have set up informal teaching networks throughout the camps. There's a real shortage of resources. Because of my research, I'm in touch with a lot of the community educators and youth who are trying to teach younger children, and I receive weekly or even daily, sometimes, requests from people who just need very basic teaching supplies and have no access to those. So you have to wonder, this response cost hundreds of millions of dollars a year, yet community teachers who are doing everything by their bootstraps that they can to teach a few children can't even procure a whiteboard and markers to teach. And I just don't think that's in anyone's interests. There's also a network of former government school teachers and even headmasters, government school headmasters in the camps, several elders who had decades of experience teaching and running government schools in Myanmar. And as I mentioned in the report, the part that you just quoted, these people could really help humanitarian agencies and the international community understand the community's education needs and priorities and desperation, the urgency that people are feeling. And of course, it will be a huge challenge, right? To get, I think it's over 400,000 school-age children and youth, to get them in school. And as the video shows, you can see the scenes of the camps. It's very overcrowded. There are scarce resources. And we also have to think about the teacher issue. I think maybe traditionally in many Myanmar communities, being a well-educated person yourself means that you're kind of automatically a teacher. But we know that high quality education requires diligent teacher training. So I think when we want to address the education shortages, we have to address the need for teacher development. And to recognize that every community wants to educate its own children, its own students. So that means empowering and training and supporting Rohingya teachers, which is a higher education process. So we have to look at the need for primary and secondary education as part of a broader landscape where we also need teacher training, and people need livelihood access, and parents need to be stable enough that they can send their children to school and address some of the child labor issues that were raised in the video. So we have to think about the broader landscape of children's rights in general. Another thing that we raised in some of our research is that there's a preference for the Myanmar curriculum. So this is not only what people are used to, but it's also what provides a link back to Myanmar and helps people feel that they're still linked to their home, to the education system in their home country. This preference, at the time that we did our very small, our research was very small, it was not well funded, and it's a mystery to me why this preference for the Myanmar language curriculum had not really been written on before our small piece. But it seems that these headmasters and teachers and education kind of key people in the community had not really been consulted in education planning. So this is also a community engagement issue, I think. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now, but happy to answer more questions.
Yeah, and Jessica, there are learning centers, and I was wondering if you could just say a little bit more about what distinguishes a learning center from a school. Also, I noted in the report a study that found that 83% of adolescents had no access to any education development activities. We have that on page 22 of our report. So this exclusion of adolescents, of older children, I guess the learning centers don't serve them. Is that correct?
Yeah, both the NGO run and community run learning centers, I think, primarily address the needs of younger learners, although there are some community initiatives to engage the more senior grades of students, but that as a matter of policy has not yet been developed within the humanitarian system. They're still piloting at a very small scale, the formal primary education.
And what would be needed to, I mean, I realized there was a conversation about whether the curriculum would be in Burmese, whether it would be in Bangla, a combination. And I guess at long last, it was decided it would be the curriculum from Burma, from Myanmar. But there's, as far as I can tell, no system of certification. Is that correct, or has that changed?
The certification and accreditation question is a bit nuanced because in Myanmar, the only real certificate that one gets is their matriculation certificate. So after completing high school, there's a matriculation exam, which is technically a university entrance and eligibility exam. And students either pass or fail that, and then they get a certificate documenting that pass or fail. So for the younger grades, there's not really a formal system of certification. But according to our research, formal education doesn't only mean accreditation to people. It means having the standardized curriculum that all children are using equally. And, people tend to prefer the education that they're accustomed to. So in Myanmar, that does mean rote learning, parrot learning, kind of rote memorization. So the more kind of international or engaged student-centered learning is still new for people also. So that is also kind of the frontier of training teachers to do more student-centered learning.
Good. Well, maybe a little bit later, I'll come back to you and ask you maybe, and I hope we get to this, any grounds for optimism and hope. A lot of the promises that we heard a couple of years ago ran into the pandemic. And in fact, pandemic levels in Bangladesh are really high now. So this remains a huge concern and an impediment, but not the only impediment to expanding education. And as we all know, there were serious restrictions on mobile phones and internet through much of 2020, which of course made distance learning almost impossible. We see a lot of these restrictions of course, in Rakhine State, in Myanmar, even before the recent coup. But we also see other restrictions in India and Malaysia and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, there's a fairly old or established Rohingya community, but they lack a lot of rights. They pass on their statelessness to their children. There's a sense of exclusion there, and not much has been written about that, to my knowledge. There's Malaysia, until recently, had a relatively good reputation, huge numbers of Rohingya, over 100,000, but at the same time, even though there was freedom of movement compared to some other places, the recent pandemic era xenophobia against refugees, against Rohingya, has really made life much more uncertain, much more difficult for Rohingya in Malaysia. And again, India, the citizenship amendment laws, the CAA, discriminate against Muslim refugees very explicitly. And in places like Jammu, where there have been traditionally quite a few Rohingya refugees, their access to education is becoming more difficult as local politicians threaten the community with destruction. So this is all very difficult. And we do treat some of this in the report. I wanted to ask Imran Hoque, our program associate, to speak a bit about his life and his challenges, because Imran has been in camps in Malaysia, in other countries, and has, besides a keen motivation to obtain an education, he has seen the challenges in a number of countries. So welcome, Imran.
Thank you, Brother Adem, and thank you for having me here. I'm not going to discuss in depth about my journey because, I am here, I am safe. It's more about the refugees who are suffering in Bangladesh, in India, in Malaysia, or in other places. But I'm a Rohingya refugee. I left when I was very young. I went to Bangladesh. I was there for a while. But the situation was very different when I went to Bangladesh. There were not many refugees when I was there, but there were no opportunities, and we didn't have any voice. So I didn't. So I left Bangladesh. I went to Malaysia, and I was in Penang for some time. In Malaysia, it's very complicated. The situation is very complicated for Rohingya because UN is presence in Malaysia. We can get a refugee status from the UN, but we are not allowed to work. We are not allowed to go to school. There are so many families. They have so many children. They are just stuck there. So there is no structure for them to obtain an education or to move forward. So, with the Rohingya, so we really need to understand the situation of the Rohingya people in the host countries. So when we leave our country, we become stateless. And then we become asylum seeker, and then we become refugees. So with our situation, we don't have the opportunity to go forward or move backward. So we are completely stuck. So with other refugees, they have an opportunity. I know their situation is not great in their home, but they still have an opportunity to go back if things are not working well for them in the host refugee host countries. But with the Rohingya, they don't have that opportunity. They are stuck, Rohingya refugees are stuck in Bangladesh. They don't have a passport. They are completely stateless, so they can't move forward. The only choice they have is both. So when I was in Malaysia, I was working with other Rohingya, and we were so young, but we didn't have choice. We didn't have anyone to support us. So many young Rohingyan are working in construction. They can lose their life within a second. There is no security, and it's when something goes wrong, nobody is there to support their voice. They don't have a voice. They don't have the language to help themselves. So when then I left Malaysia because I wanted to go to Australia. I heard about Australia, and I thought, if I went to Australia, I would have the opportunity to go to school, to learn and to improve myself and help my community. And I left Malaysia. I went to Indonesia, but I couldn't make it, and I was detained nearly for 2 years in Indonesia. And when I was in Indonesia, there were more than 200 Rohingya refugees were in the camp, but we didn't have a single person who could speak or write. So we saw other refugees who were, writing letters to UN. And also when we had visitors from the UN, they were talking to them, but we didn't have that language to talk to them and explain what was happening. So we were voiceless in the camp because we didn't have education. We didn't have the opportunity to go to school back home. And then when we left, we get stuck in the camps. And in those places, we don't get the opportunity to go to school or learn. So in Indonesia, I realized that, I don't have a choice. I can't go backward and I can't move forward. So what can I do? I started thinking learning, but I didn't have any resources. I couldn't do anything. I didn't know where to start. But I received my refugee status, and then I was released in Indonesia. And when I was in the community, I realized that, okay, now I am free. I want to go to school. But in those host countries, I was not allowed to go to school. I was not allowed to, work. There are thousands of refugees, and they are just waiting for years, 10 years, 15 years, and they're just stuck in their rooms. They don't have an opportunity to go to school. And I just don't understand why these host countries provide education for refugees. If they had an opportunity to go to school and learn, they don't have to waste their time. When they get an opportunity to be resettled in a third country, they would be ready to contribute to the world. But these host countries are putting restriction on education, and I just don't understand why. And so I left again. I went to Australia. I finally made it to Australia, but they changed. The Australian government changed their refugee policy in 2013, and I was transferred to one of the Australia's offshore camp on Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. And I was there for nearly 5 years, from 2013 to 2018, before I came to the United States. So when I was in the camp, I realized that I can't change my situation. I can't change the current situation. I didn't have any opportunity. So, one sketch paper, and I had a broken pencil, and they changed my life. I just started writing. I wrote one sentence or two sentences every day, and I just fell in love with writing. And to write, I had to learn the language. I didn't have resources, but I used my time very wisely. I spent my time with security guards, caseworkers. I asked them to help me, and it was completely my motivation. But it's very rare for refugees to learn something new in the camp, because the places are not designed for people to learn. These refugee camps and detention centers are designed to destroy human strength. So we become very hopeless. People can become depressed so easily. So there is no way people can learn. But somehow I managed to be strong, and I became a teacher for my community in the camp. And then I became an advocate for refugees, and I became a writer. I started writing, and that's how I survived in the camp. So what I'm trying to explain is that education is the key for the refugees to survive in those camps, because they can see that when things change, they will have a future. So it's the government, the host countries need to have a structure for refugees, so that they can get an education. Because if there is no structure, if there is no system in place, and if they can't get an education, they can waste their time and they can waste their life. Like the current situation, Rohingya refugees had hope that they would be able to go back to Burma, but I don't see, I don't see that they can go back to Burma anytime soon. And also the conversation has shifted. You know, no one is talking, the international community is not talking about the Rohingya situation. They are just talking about the military coup. So, you know, Rohingya will continue to suffer from this type of atrocities, and it will continue to happen. And also, if Rohingya went to Burma, if they are not included in the constitution, they will still suffer in Burma because they are not included in the constitution. If we are not included in the constitution, we don't have any rights. So we need systemic change in Burma. We need to be included in the constitution to have our rights, and then we can go back to Burma. So, and I don't think we can change all these things anytime soon. So while they are waiting in Bangladesh, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in India, you know, the host countries can provide education to these refugees to change their life. You know, we are not asking for anything else, just education. It's so simple. You know, it's our basic human rights. And if we can get an education, then, you know, then we can move forward with our lives. I'm not just talking about the education for the kids. There are so many adults in the camp. They are ready to move forward. They are ready to get into college. They are ready. These host countries needs to provide some sort of assistance so that they can go to college, so that they can learn, so that they can explain their situation. Because in Burma, our government didn't want us to go to school because they don't want us to be part of the political system. They didn't want us to learn about our country, about our system, about our history. So while we are waiting here, we want the international community to focus on our education, because with education, we can change our situation and we can improve our community. Nearly 500,000 Rohingya children are growing up without any education in the camp. It's heartbreaking, and the future is dark for our people. And that's the only thing that I want to say to the international community, to really focus on education. And for the Bangladesh government, it's easy for them to create a structure, because, you know, the fund is there. They just need the structure, and also to lift all the restriction so that Rohingya can obtain an education while they are waiting in these places. These places are hopeless, but I think education will provide them some sort of hope to continue to live in the camp. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Brother Imran. And that's eloquent testimony. And you mentioned to me once that living in the camps, some refugees and displaced people, their perspective narrows to survival, and they stop dreaming about education and a future outside the gates. So your testimony can help keep that dream alive for others. I think also, we have attending this webinar, but off screen, we have one of the speakers from the video, community teacher Hujat Ullah, and really appreciate his participating in both the discussion and the video. Frontline workers are key here, though we do need to convince the nations and the donors to change their policies, to open the doors to the schools, to fund the schools. So we're going to have a next speaker will be Bill Van Esveld from Human Rights Watch, and then I will ask Imam Malik to reflect and also bring in the aspect of community-run madrasas, because this is often overlooked, and we did include this in the report. It's important to have an understanding of community-run, volunteer-run efforts, and then support them, not take control, not change them necessarily, but support them, help them be recognized with standardized curriculum and so forth. And some of this is already happening, but needs to be scaled up. So Bill, welcome.
Hi, thank you very much, Adem.
Yeah, you know, we mentioned your report from 2019. I believe it's called Are We Not Human? Based on 163 interviews. And it really describes the restrictions on Rohingya education very well. And then Human Rights Watch also wrote in January 2020, very hopefully, that government plans to allow a pilot project for 10,000 children would go through. And of course, we all know that the pandemic and the lockdown came soon after that. I was wondering if you could reflect back a few years and how you see the various stages of this crisis developing in Bangladesh.
That's the right place for me to start, absolutely. Actually, I want to say something in case there's anybody who's listening who is in the same position of ignorance that I was in when I started my research. I just want to tell a quick story. Because I didn't know, you know, the first thing I heard about the Rohingya crisis was August 2017, when a massive military campaign of atrocities, you know, led hundreds of thousands of people to flee for their lives into Bangladesh. And that's when I started hearing about problems with lack of access to education for those children who fled to Bangladesh in 2017. I didn't know that there had been Rohingya children who were born and who grew up their entire lives in Bangladesh since the 1970s, who had also been denied any real access to education. This is not a new policy. This is not a new problem. This is a very long-term, disastrous human rights abuse. And I want to clarify, this is not just a humanitarian problem. This is human rights abuse. The right to education is very basic, very fundamental. It gives you the right to have other rights. You know, why is education something that we're all focusing on? Why are we so concerned about it? You know, without education, you're much likelier to go into hazardous child labor. Lack of education, lack of hope for the future drives children to become victims of horrendous abuses during smuggling and trafficking to try and get to a better future. By contrast, if you have an education, you know, there's been decades of studies funded by the World Bank that have found every year you go to school as a child, as an adult, your earnings from your job increase by 9% per year. So education is, you know, it's about basic human dignity. It's about the flourishing of children and as adults. It's about safety and protection. And it would also be good for any host country to lift the restrictions that they're imposing on kids' access to school, and which have been going on in Bangladesh for decades. I met kids who couldn't get any education in the camps before 2017, and whose only option to go to school was to pretend they were Bangladeshis. These were really smart kids. They had learned the Bangladesh language, even though they weren't living with Bangladeshi people. They were living in camps. And they were so eager for education, they saved up money so that they could get themselves through back channels into Bangladeshi schools, because that's the only way they were going to get a real education. And the most astonishing thing that I found, you know, this is sort of this earlier generation of Rohingya kids, is that the Bangladesh government sent intelligence agencies to track down these children who had done no crime other than to get themselves into school, identify them, and then threaten the principals of the schools that if you don't expel the children because they're Rohingya, we will punish the school. And so Rohingya kids were made to stand up in their class, put their school books on the desk, take off their uniforms, and marched out of the gate. I mean, it is the most disgusting discrimination in a classroom situation that I'd ever heard of, frankly. So this is not a new problem, and I'm going on about this with a bit of anger because it's been happening for so many decades that unless the international community gets off their backsides and really presses the authorities in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, to change the policy is not going to change. We've got to see concerted calling out of this discrimination and denial of education for what it is. It is a human rights crisis and a human rights abuse that cannot stand. So sorry about that. Let me go back to your question. Yes, to go back to what Jessica Olney was talking about, it is astonishing that it was really her reporting with PRIO that I think brought the fact to the attention of the international community that there were a whole bunch of really dedicated Rohingya teachers and educators in the camps who were doing everything they could to reach kids with education because of all the red lines that Bangladesh had laid down. And until her report came out, nobody was really talking about them in the humanitarian community. All the Rohingya knew all about them, people on the ground knew all about them, but nobody was funding them, nobody was talking about supporting them. In fact, their schools were the only place Rohingya kids could get a formal curriculum in the language that they all told me they wanted, which was the Burmese language, for the reasons that have been laid out already. It gives you a sense of home and a place to go home to, and it's a better quality education than what the education sector in Bangladesh had come up with. This sort of learning competency framework and approach that wasn't taught in schools, it was taught in learning centers. It wasn't a real curriculum, it was a learning competency framework. It didn't go to secondary school, it only covered the first two or three grades. I mean, it was supposed to be a workaround to get around all the red lines that the Bangladesh authorities had imposed on education for Rohingya kids. It's not a curriculum, it's not good enough. UNHCR itself said that when it was being developed. So where could Rohingya kids go for education? Only to these Rohingya-led, Rohingya-driven and created unofficial schools in the camps. And I think, there was some pressure that was finally built up on the international community as well as the Bangladesh authorities to recognize that this was the best option Rohingya kids had, that they shouldn't be subject to arbitrary closures by Bangladeshi camp officials, which was happening. They should instead be funded and supported and protected. That was all supposed to happen in 2020, and then the coronavirus happened. Everything got locked down. The camps have been, covered in barbed wire. The internet signals and 3G has been cut off. And these pilot projects to actually support Rohingya educators haven't taken off. That's where we are now. And, we have to say, coronavirus is not an excuse for discrimination against children's education. And when it is publicly healthy and safe to do so, the response needs to be over-inclusive. There was a crisis before coronavirus. Coronavirus made it worse. So the reaction has to be reach out to every family and make sure that schools are actually accessible and lift these ridiculous restrictions. You can't even build a school for these kids in the camps. They go to bamboo huts that are like 1 story tall and that rot every year because of the conditions and that are not safe and that get washed away in the severe weather conditions there. Like the permanent structures can be built in the camps for Bangladeshi camp officials, but somehow it's illegal and wrong to build real school buildings. And it's good enough to have kids learning in incredibly overcrowded environments, but you can't even build a 2-story school or something that could survive strong winds and rains. So I think what we really need to get focus on is the restrictions that Bangladesh is imposing. This is not about, yes, Bangladesh is not a country with a whole bunch of extra resources, and they have been very, I have to recognize, they saved a huge number of lives by opening their borders. And frankly, somebody from a Western country has no position to lecture Bangladesh about how to treat refugees. And I'm not lecturing anybody. When my own country, the United States, has not been nearly so generous as Bangladesh has. Nonetheless, to go back to where we started, this is only in Bangladesh's self-interest, and it's in the, its minimum obligations under human rights law to allow these kids to get a real education and to lift the red lines that are blocking that.
A very strong and important points. Bill, I was wondering, we hear from some humanitarian agencies that they are very nervous about making any kind of criticism of the Bangladesh government because they're afraid that they'll be thrown out, frankly. And so constructive criticism is not always welcome. But how can we get past that? I mean, even recently, Save the Children issued a report on Rohingya education, a very good report, very much aligned with our own findings, completely independent from ours and ours from theirs. And I think they're mutually supportive. I thought it was an excellent report and even a hard-hitting report. But I think that some big agencies are nervous about promoting their findings because of this political atmosphere. So how do we get past that?
Well, I should say it's easy for me to talk because Human Rights Watch is a reporting, monitoring, advocacy organization. We don't run humanitarian programs. We don't run schools. So I'm not at risk of having other people hurt by having my programs shut down because I don't have programs. So it's, I'm trying to play that role to the best I can because that's my obligation. Those organizations and agencies that are working on the ground and that are at risk of being shut down if they speak out too much, well, that's life and we shouldn't put the burden on them. They're at political risk, and if they get shut down, it's the kids who get hurt. Nobody cares if a bunch of foreigners in nice white shirts and suits get thrown out. It's the kids who will suffer. So the burden shouldn't be on those organizations. It should be the United Nations. It should be the Secretary General, and it should be the international community, and it should be individual big donor governments that have studied this problem, that know what's going on in the camps with education and denial of rights for the kids. The United States, Canada, the Canadian ambassador to the United Nations right now is Bob Ray, who did a lot of work reporting on the situation and abuses that Rohingya people have experienced. Australia, the UK, several countries really know what's going on and could raise their voices much more loudly and just call it out for what it is. Work with Bangladesh to the extent possible, but also call out, otherwise two things happen. One is the discrimination and abuse against Rohingya children is perpetrated for another generation on our watch. It's happening now, and it's nobody else's responsibility except for ours. And the second thing is that we, and by we here, I mean people who are invested in the idea of international law, who are invested in the idea of human rights and protections for refugees, because it could happen to anybody. We are allowing ourselves to be made a mockery of, and these institutions to be decayed. The world made a promise that every refugee child would be in school within 3 months of displacement at the Global Refugee Forum, implementing the Global Compact on Refugees. 3 months, what a joke. It's been 4 years since Rohingya, it's been more than 4 years. It's been 40 years since Rohingya refugee children in Bangladesh have had no access to education. We can't just sit by and not only let this continue to happen to Rohingya refugee children, but to let the supposed values and the supposed laws we say we're fighting for be trampled over. So I think it's up to donors. I think it's up to the UN. I think it's up to big international organizations to continue calling this out.
Thanks, Bill. At the end of our report, we do make a number of recommendations, both to the host countries and the United States government, but also I think the largest number of recommendations are to the UN and the international community to use its power to implement these requirements. We have a question here in the chat. I wanted to, oops, I just lost it, about UNHCR, and it is there a UNHCR policy that requires to maintain Rohingya refugee status, that they don't get national ID cards by the Bangladesh government issued, lack of which leads to no education, or there is no such policy under the UN? I don't know if that's clear enough, but if you could address this status issue.
I mean, international law is very clear, and as a United Nations organization, UNHCR is bound to abide by international law. And international law says any child, regardless of whether they have an ID document, regardless of whether they're a refugee or an illegal migrant or an asylum seeker or whatever, every child has the right to quality education without discrimination. So these things cannot be linked. Whether you have an ID card or not, under international law, if somebody is imposing that policy, they're violating international law. Now, I know this is a complicated question. Human Rights Watch just put out a report about how UNHCR is actually responsible for collecting biometric information from Rohingya people without telling them that they were going to share it with the Myanmar authorities that had persecuted them. So, there are not necessarily clean hands here, but if that's happening, it shouldn't be. It's out and out illegal.
Good point. Well, I did want to ask one more sensitive question, because Human Rights Watch can address these things. Basan Char. To what extent is this very controversial program to move Rohingya refugees to this isolated, possibly dangerous island? To what extent is their education made available there?
That's a really tragic case that my colleagues recently reported on. Basan Char was described by somebody we interviewed as a prison island in the middle of the sea. It is remote from anywhere, and yet the Bangladeshi authorities have moved about 18 to people to Basan Char. It's so bad that they are now desperate to get back to the overcrowded, unhygienic, barbed wire camps that periodically burn down in Cox's Bazar from Basan Char. At great personal risk to themselves, they are demanding to be released. Children have been beaten up for trying to get away from Basan Char Island by Bangladeshi security forces. And one of the ways that Bangladeshi authorities tried to convince Rohingya to leave the Cox's Bazar camps to go to Basan Char was by falsely promising that they would have access to quality education, that they would get real schooling, along with promises of monetary compensation and other promises that have been broken. There isn't any quality education on Basan Char. We think there's about 8,000 school-aged Rohingya children on the island, of whom maybe a little over 1,000 are going to the same sorts of learning centers that are not schools, that are not teaching a curriculum, that are not teaching in the Myanmar language or a curriculum, that are not accredited. It's the same stuff as is going on in Cox's Bazar, and few children are able to access it.
Hmm.
And I should say, to answer your question about this possibly dangerous island, yeah, very possibly dangerous island. It didn't exist until 20 years ago. It's a piece of silt that accumulated in the Bay of Bengal that's extremely prone to flooding. The United Nations has not been allowed to conduct an assessment to see whether it's safe. It was uninhabited, until this brilliant plan to, basically coerce a bunch of refugees to go live there. Very dangerous, particularly given the number of people who have died from severe weather in the Bay of Bengal. And that's right where this island is located. It's hours away from hospital. We think that 25% of the population on the island right now might have come down with diarrhea. Children are dying of preventable diseases, and there's no medical care for hours. And it's completely inaccessible in bad weather.
This world does not need any more prison islands, that's for sure. Jessica mentioned in the chat, and I'm going to read her comment, if you don't mind, Jessica. I think it's relevant to Basan Char. The fundamental policy challenge is that the refugee response is still regarded by the government as a short-term emergency intervention. This means there are big obstacles for addressing longer-term community development needs, which includes basic needs like livelihoods, education, etc. I'd also say the Rohingya are being regarded as a collective security threat, rather than a vulnerable group in need of rehabilitation support. I think that says a lot. And again, isolating them as if they're a threat instead of investing them as a human in their human potential is shocking and very short-sighted. And we hope that, with all due respect for their taking in the Rohingya, that the government of Bangladesh will reconsider their policies. So I'd like to call on Imam Malik, our chairman, and to say a few words, perhaps first, about the community-run madrasa system, since this is an overlooked aspect of the community-run, volunteer-driven Rohingya response to this crisis, but also to reflect on what we've been discussing today. So thank you very much for joining us, Imam Malik. I hope you can get on the screen. I see your name there. And if not, we'll have to move on. Okay, good.
Just give me a second, please.
Yes, certainly. Again, I hope people will go to the Burma Task Force website under campaigns. This is one of our campaigns. It's our main campaign at the moment. The other has to do with genocide determination. And we hope that people will look at the various actions that people can take to be part of the solution to this problem. This is a campaign that will be running for several months. And yeah, thank you, Imam Malik. Hopefully you could say a few words about the madrasa system and then reflect generally, inshallah, on the general challenge in front of us.
Well, thank you so much, Adem. And Bill, please stay angry. I need a whole lot of people who speak the way you spoke. Unfortunately, it seems he has left. But anybody in communication, Adem, please tell him that's the voice needed. This is absolutely what is the call of the day. It is just a horrible situation which has been neglected for too long. And we need to put focus on it. And yes, some cannot speak who are providing services, but I feel they are too compliant also. If they just be slightly louder, slightly methodological, just a few memos in the right places by all the UN system and NGOs who are working. I met, almost for 5 days, I met teachers, students in those camps, and heads of NGOs specifically in charge of education. And all of them agreed to several things, except that they are very, in whispering mode. So I think, Bill, you contributed, other than information, the passion which is needed for this. So thank you so much. I missed some of the presentations, but thank you all. I heard Jessica partially, Abdullah and Imran, and thank you so much. There was a apartheid before genocide. Rakhine, according to 10-year-old census, 84.70% of Rakhine Buddhist people, Rakhine as a whole, has 84.70% literacy rate, while Rohingyas at best 20% literacy, because it was managed. In apartheid, at least, there will be some school only for blacks and all that, but not in this case. And so serious efforts were made to keep them out of the education system, and type of things which Rohingyas tried to do in Bangladesh, pretending to be Bangladeshi or using several means to defeat the system to get some education. Multiple those efforts were made in Burma before, after 1982. Because in 82, citizenship cancellation made a legitimate, quote unquote, reasoning for the Burmese not to allow them in the school system, but they will give this and that. And many of those teachers, when we interviewed about 160 people in fall of 2017 and early 2018, they use other means, not a legitimate means in the eyes of the Burmese government to get some education. And that's how we have 1,000+ teachers there. I met several of them. So after 1982, it became difficult. So they started strengthening the madrasa system, which was already there in place. But because of not allowing them general education, Madrasa system became the single largest education network in Rakhine for Rohingya people. But that educational system has its limitation. I mean, I myself is a graduate of that system, and they actually develop a university based on that system called Darul Uloom Ahmadiyya, and which produce a whole lot of people, but it has limitations in terms of what curriculum. But the major limitation is what you're going to do with the graduate. You graduated, but not what. What are you going to do? They can only be certain level of imams. But even that system was banned in 2012. August 2012, that system was completely banned. And of course, no one can get into a mosque. Now, I met several of them. Some are great teachers went to India, got very high level of education in madrasa system. They call them muhaddith. So you go through, like in Bangladesh, they have the system Maulvi, Alim, Fadil, Kamil. And after all of that, that's a recognized system in Bangladesh, half of it run by the government. Then you become muhaddis. So this is the highest level. It's like not only doing a PhD, but actually getting recognized by the work which you're contributing. So some of them were at that high level. But take you to the micro level, Tulatuli was a village on which I focused substantially. I met a lot of the people. Tulatuli is a place where a major massacre took place. Burma Task Force did extensive research among them. And I discovered two mayors and have detailed meetings with them, as well as the secretary of the village and many other people there. So there were 5 top teachers. One of them was very highly educated, PhD above level. He was 90-year-old. He was literally quartered by these people. So they, after 2012, when all madrasa were banned, which was the alternate system, they decided to eliminate teachers and intellectuals and scholars and what some of them lower level call them Maulvis. Now, that system is the largest education system in the Rohingya camps. I was sort of, 2017, August and September, walking up and down, and in the beginning of 2018, you keep hearing call for prayer. So I thought, well, these people are, pardon the expression, awfully religious. I mean, I'm a religious person. I'm an Imam myself. Only dawned upon me after a while that it is sort of a celebration of freedom, because in Burma and Rakhine, they cannot call the Adhan, and in the Tulatuli, they had no prayers because all the mosques were banned. And on the Eid time, they developed this ingenious system that in the jungle, from the front it's a jungle, but they created an opening inside that. And then they have 3 layers of security outside. So when people are sneaking in, they're watching, because the village was essentially all Rohingyas until they brought about 300 Buddhists and settled them there, which has electricity and but Tulatuli. So Muslims there, Rohingya were about 3,000 and about 300 other people. Other people have electricity and a school and everything. Initially, before 2012, they will allow Rohingya children to get there. They will have to walk a while, walk quite a bit. But then they will dismiss them in the first 1 or 2 hours, while a school will go on later on. And that was even not allowed after a while. So there, they developed the system of going to home by home. When madrasa was banned 2012, they found out, and they said, no, you cannot go to home and teach. There is only one teacher who survived. 4 were murdered, and one, which was the highest scholar In madrasa where I went, there was only one person at that level out of 40 or 50 teachers. So he was. So going to the conclusion, brothers, first thing is, Bill, if I find some cloning technology, you are one person from Human Rights Watch, I like to be cloned because I need this voice to go all over. Just look at it. I mean, it's such an important report being issued altogether. We have 20, 25 people present here. America need to hear that. And who told me this? In a whispering way, I was told about that by UNHCR, OIM, BRAC, all their education leaders told me. I'm not going to say when and where because they were whispering and I am putting their name out there, not their individual name, but the organization and a lot of NGOs. They were saying these people not going to move and will not allow until the United States and other donor countries make it a major issue. They were very clear. These people are not going back. And you land in Cox's Bazar, you go to the camp. What is the board you see? Board of the Mother of Humanity. I like to appeal to the Mother of Humanity to allow your children of humanity full education. Nothing should be stopped. And it's not just the Myanmar curriculum and certification, which you expect them not to go back. Madrasa system, which they develop in Rakhine. I studied the Bangladeshi madrasa system, spoke to people who are graduate of the madrasa system. And the Bangladesh, just by one executive order, make them qualify with the same system, same exam and same thing. So they will have a degree which is recognizable in Bangladesh. Since it is recognizable in Bangladesh, if they go back to Burma or in Malaysia and everywhere, it will be recognizable. I know that system, it will automatically connect. Similarly, the certification, whoever in the NGOs are willing to open a school, and I can tell you there are a lot of people who are willing to devote money for that particular school. And it will develop into something. But this Bangladeshi government policy must be changed. And the way to change is those of you who are in America and Canada. Canada has given $300 million. America has given $3 billion with the B. And all organizations here, we're going to mobilize the Faith Coalition. I already have my memos in the White House and in the National Security Council. And since Jessica and Bill are there, you need to note this particular point, that State Department, it is still not at the level of dealing with the type of issues which we are talking about. So right now, our address need to be National Security Council and the White House. That's how we need to start tying. And my request to each one of you is, including Imran, we need more memos on these things. So build it up, build it up. Just, these people don't read reports. So 2 pages of this thing, that Bangladesh policy is not connected with the 700,000 people who came after 2017. It's the historic policy. That particular point itself should be just independent point. Now, Bangladesh is looking for something. Anytime I meet an ambassador or any of their foreign office people, they are looking for, what is it called, GPS, GSP, or general system of GSP, general system of preferences. Maybe that could be something which America can handle if they are willing to change this particular policy. 2 generations were lost by Burmese policy. Another generation cannot be lost because of the Bangladeshi policies. Thank you so much, Adem, for organizing this.
Thank you, Imam. And yeah, I mean, your comments remind us, that the root causes were in Burma, in Rakhine State, in the terrible, systematic, genocidal persecution of the Rohingya themselves over so many years, and this continues. And with the coup, we must stop pretending that repatriation is possible anytime soon. So policies must change, donors must take notice, ensure that all donations include meaningful education, as we've been discussing. I think that we have very little time left, so I wanted to give all the panelists a last 1 or 2 minutes to just make any comments that were on their minds before we conclude. I appreciate the engagement of people on the chat, great comments and suggestions, and it's been very meaningful to have Rohingya from the camps actually participating. We share your concern. We feel the solidarity, but we also need to somehow scale up our response and engage these people with power effectively. Maybe in reverse order, starting with you, Bill, and any last comments, any grounds for hope or opportunity?
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to follow up two quick things that Imam Malik was saying. I believe he was speaking about how easy it would be for Bangladesh to certify the religious education that Rohingya can achieve for themselves in madrasas, in the camps. And I just wanted to say, the same logic applies. I fully agree, it's an excellent point, and the same logic applies to secular education. And not only can it happen, it has happened in other countries. In Turkey, which received the largest number of refugees from Syria after the horrific abuses by the Syrian government, they had so many Syrian kids in Turkey that the school system in Turkish, which is taught in Turkish language, and none of these kids spoke Turkish, there was no way they could have gotten into school. So Turkey actually did an excellent thing. They said, we will accredit and officially recognize Syrian refugee-led schools taught by Syrian refugee teachers using the Syrian curriculum in Arabic. That was done by the government of Turkey, not in Turkish, not in the Turkish school system. Otherwise, the whole thing would have been a disaster. Now they're bringing those kids in. It's been years now, so they are bringing them into the national education system, as they should, as is their obligation. But initially, they just certified what the refugees were able to teach themselves with their great cultural capital, as they should have done, and as Bangladesh can do. Bangladesh is taking advice from Turkey on other matters. They should take advice from Turkey on how to formally recognize refugee education. And the second thing, I'm really embarrassed I forgot to emphasize this. I was talking about, human rights and international law and how this is not just a humanitarian crisis, it's a human rights crisis. I forgot to mention probably the most important thing, which is that there are international standards on how to deal with education for refugee populations. The INEE Institute has put out these standards. All countries agree to them. And the most important one is that refugee education needs to be led by, directed by, programmed by refugee communities themselves. There has been an absolute failure of consultation of Rohingya refugees for what education they want. And again, to point to the work that Jessica Olney did, why did it have to be her report that brought to light, what people wanted and what they were teaching? The Myanmar curriculum up to the highest level, not just the lowest few grades. Had Rohingya refugees been seriously consulted from the beginning, maybe we would have had not just a pilot project that hasn't actually gotten off the ground yet. Maybe we would have had international support to Rohingya schools in the camps from the beginning, because that is apparently what the communities actually want. So I think we need to continue hammering home these messages. I am partly optimistic because the situation so far has been, I think it's so bad that it is actually a threat. And the more you tell people about it who are ignorant of it, the more they are forced to take action. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. How about Brother Imran next?
Thank you, Brother Adem, and thank you everyone for your speeches. It's been really eye-opening to learn the work that you have been doing. So one thing that I want to mention is that, what drove me to leave these countries? That's because I was in Bangladesh, I was in Malaysia, I was in Indonesia, I was in Australia. So the only thing that drove me out of this country, because I didn't have the opportunity to educate myself. I couldn't go to school. I didn't have the opportunity to work. So as a human being, so if I'm not allowed to get an education, if I'm not allowed to work, what am I supposed to do for years? So that's the question that people need to understand. And with the Rohingya situation, we are stateless. We don't have any opportunity to go anywhere. Once we leave our country, that's it. And we only have one option to leave one country to go to another country, and it's both. So it's like I am taking my life in my hand to obtain an education. So if the government of Bangladesh provide education, they can save thousands or millions of lives of and Rohingya children and the young adults will not put their lives on the board again. And also, so I just want the international community to see when they provide education, what happens. So I know I educated myself and it's totally my motivation. But when I came to this nation in 2018, I became a voice for my whole community. I see there are hundreds of Rohingya who speaks multiple languages, but they don't have the ability to speak English, so they cannot use their languages. If they could speak English, they could become an asset for this nation because they speak 10 different languages, and it's fascinating. Because they didn't have the opportunity to go to school, or they did, when they come here, the refugee resettlement process is very fragile at the moment. And that's why when they come here, they go to work and then they just can't develop themselves. There is no system in place, but they can become an asset if they can speak English. So while the Rohingya refugees are waiting in the camp in Bangladesh, in India, in Malaysia, if they get an education, they will become an asset for the world. They can contribute to the common good of the world. So this is very simple. I'm not criticizing any government. I'm grateful that this host nation are, helping the Rohingya people to live in their country. We are grateful, but at the same time, it's feasible for them to provide an education for our community so that we can contribute to the world. That's all I want to say, and thank you, Adam. You are muted.
Thank you. Yes, recognizing that immigrants and refugees are an asset, even in the United States, where sometimes we also hear this anti-immigrant sentiment. It's very important to embrace their potential. So, Jessica.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, I just wanted to use the last of my time to just really uplift the contributions of Rohingya refugee youth in Bangladesh, and also their motivation and dedication and curiosity. I've had the real honor of working in an educational and training capacity with hundreds of camp youth over the last few years, and these are some of the most motivated, curious, ambitious students that I've ever met. And coming from the US, where kids can take education for granted sometimes, I can assure you that if education becomes more accessible to youth in the camps, not a single person will take it for granted. And these will be some of the most dedicated students you can imagine. As Imran mentioned, there are students who speak a dozen languages. I mean, this is incredible. This is a resource, and it should be looked at as a resource. I think it's not in anyone's interests anywhere to deny education to these students. And the more that they have access, the more contributions they can make. This can also lead to livelihood and economic development, not only in the camps, in the local, regional, and national economy in Bangladesh and other refugee hosting countries. So we don't have to have antagonism around the issue of education. It should be looked at as something that will be good for everyone, everywhere. And there shouldn't be any hindrance to it. And yeah, I just want to uplift the role of both community educators and students. If they cannot access community learning spaces, they access learning resources online for self-directed study, which someone asked about in the questions. If internet access is not available in the camps, people will literally climb to a hilltop in the dark at night just to access internet to watch educational, videos on YouTube. That's the level of motivation that we're talking about. And so I just want to uplift that and, just echo the point that education will only help and it will only be mutually beneficial for all stakeholders, and no one is benefited by the denial of education.
Thank you, Jessica. The erasure of education seems to me a continuation of genocide, of denying a people their rightful place in our common future. And so it's very important to just recognize this basic humanity of each other and work to ensure that government policies also recognize this fact. Really good comments today, and the last speaker, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Like to ask our filmmaker, if he's still with us, Brother Abdullah Habib, who despite the monsoons and the rain and all the lockdown and the problems in the camps, was able to put together some footage for us. And I was wondering if Brother Abdullah is still with us. Yes.
Yes, hello, Adam. I can hear you, but I cannot open my camera because I do not have any electricity now here. Very dark here now.
Do you have a few last words? Yes.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone, every panelist who will speak today in this conversation, especially for the education matter. So it was very, very experience moment for me. And also this is the monsoon here. We also having many challenges in this time in the camp, as also I mentioned in the video. So it is really critical situation for every Rohingya to survive in this situation. We refugee are not surviving the way we should survive, the way every refugee in other country in around the world survive. But we don't have such situation, such condition in the Bangladesh refugee camp. We face many challenging situation. We face many critical situation. So currently we are very restricted from movement. We cannot go from camp to another camp. From yesterday, it is announced that every movement, every activity, even NGOs activity are banned for 7 days. It's been 3 months continuous lockdown, restriction setting in the camp. We cannot go out from the camp. We cannot go anywhere. Also, the camp is the camp, all the around the camp is fence with the bever wire. So the exits where we can go out from the camp set of checkposts. So we cannot go out from the camp easily. We have to show the CAC permission, the camp in charge permission that if we need to go out, but we cannot get the permission very easily. And also the CAC do not provide permission if if we do not have any emergency situation. So this all the thing we are uh, facing and surviving in Bangladesh refugee camp currently. So thank you so much for hearing me and having me here. Yeah,
Thank
that's
you
all.
very much, Brother Abdullah. And despite all those many very real challenges, you're able to be with us. And it's very telling that you're calling to us, you're joining us out of darkness, literally. And we're speaking about bringing the light of education, sharing the light of education, which everyone deserves access to. I hope that the Bangladesh public will also see it this way, and that there will be partnerships to open the doors to the classrooms, to allow all people their rights. And there's a lot of work to be done, both in Bangladesh and all the other host countries. Uh, Good to know about the Turkish model, good to know about positive models, and the many efforts that are being made in all these uh, countries that need support. So we will continue with our campaign through this summer at least, and perhaps longer. And please do join our Burma Task Force website. Look for the Rohingya education campaign. We will be having actions. We'll be trying to influence policymakers. We'll be convening uh, other events as well, discussions with the impacted communities. And so I want to thank everybody very much for joining this. Very nice to hear from the Sikh brothers and sisters who just wrote us, and other partners who have been struggling with the system and trying to provide uh, services. Let's make it easy. Let's make it work. And thank you, everybody. I think we're going to sign off now. But God bless you all. God bless the Rohingya.
Thank you.